Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Federal Funding for Capital and Planning Projects to Address Economic Impacts of COVID-19. My name is Carrie Stevens, and I'm a new planning administrator with the Community Development Group at the Atlanta Regional Commission. My focus will be on the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, known as Catalyst, and other planning initiatives. And I will also be the moderator for today's webinar. Heard my slides not advancing.
Just try clicking on the PowerPoint slide and see if it pops up.
There we go. Sorry about that. We are very lucky to have Jonathan Corso, the Georgia representative for the Economic Development Administration in the Atlanta Regional Office today. He provides applicants with technical assistance, reviews funding requests, and makes funding recommendations. Mr. Corso received his Master of Public Administration from Syracuse University and his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Massachusetts. Jonathan will outline the impact of the CARES Act in Georgia and provide guidance on capital and planning projects eligible for funding. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you will know how to participate in today's event. You have entered the webinar in listen-only mode. We have taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface, which will be located on your computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. You are listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed. If your internet speeds are having difficulty, click on the camera drop-down menu in the control panel and select a different camera option or turn off the cameras. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the question and answer session at the end of today's webinar. You may also see chat messages from us in that window. If we were unable to get all the questions in the allotted time, contact information for both Jonathan and I is located at the end of the presentation. This and past webinars are recorded and saved currently on ARC's COVID operations page, and the link is provided here. Our next topic will be supporting local businesses during COVID-19, and that will occur next Tuesday, May 26th from 2:30 to 3:30. And now I would like to welcome Jonathan and let him get started with his presentation.
All right. Thank you, Carrie. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you to the Atlanta Regional Commission for setting this up. Hold on one second. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. So my plan for today, again, my name is Jonathan Corso. I'm the Georgia representative for the U.S. Economic Development Administration. My plan for today is to do about a 12 or 15-minute PowerPoint presentation, basically an EDA 101, just an introduction to the agency if you're not familiar, and then some specific information about the CARES Act and how you might take advantage of it. And afterwards, we'll have questions and answers, and hopefully plenty of time for questions and answers. So very quickly, our mission statements for Commerce and EDA. All you really need to know about the agency is that our mission is all about creating jobs and attracting private investment. That's been our mission for over 50 years, and that will always be our mission. We have 6 regional offices around the country. You, of course, are located in the Atlanta region, and you can see the 8 states that the Atlanta region represents. And while I don't want you to think of those other 7 states as your competition, in some ways they are. We in Atlanta don't review projects from Maine or Texas or Washington. We only review projects in our 8 states. And each state in our region has an economic development representative such as myself who provides technical assistance to applicants. So EDA has a number of different grant programs. These are all grants. We don't do loans. We have construction grants. These are typically used for public infrastructure projects like water, sewer, road, rail. We also fund the construction of small business incubators, workforce development centers, and under some very limited circumstances, we can finance the acquisition of machinery and equipment. Now, what we need in order to participate in any construction project is we need a committed private sector beneficiary, a company, who's willing to make specific job and private investment commitments to the project. We generally don't do speculative projects, although under the CARES Act, we're going to have some more flexibility. But you cannot use EDA funds as an incentive tool, and you cannot use EDA funds to pirate or steal jobs from other states. We need new jobs and new private investment. The other types of grants we have are non-construction grants. These can be used for feasibility studies, technical assistance reports, engineering studies, tourism studies, things of that nature. Now, while we don't have a specific job or private investment requirement on those funds, what we do require is that those funds are used for economic development purposes and not for community development. So eligible applicants include public bodies, cities, counties, development authorities, tribes, economic development districts. In Georgia, those are your 12 regional commissions. Colleges and universities are eligible, as are nonprofits. Now, nonprofits are only eligible if they can get written local government support. Typically, we get a letter from the mayor or whoever the chief elected official is of the city or county where the project is physically located. What we don't want to do is we don't want to engage in a project that the local government is opposed to. And so we get the local government's written support for that project. In some cases, we'll ask that the local government sign on as a co-applicant, but in most cases, we're satisfied with just a general letter of support from the local government. So to be eligible for an EDA grant, you must be located in an economically distressed region. We have a number of ways of measuring economic distress, but under the CARES Act, there's really only one measure that really matters, and that is having a negative impact from COVID-19, which all 159 Georgia counties are having, and indeed all 159 Georgia counties are eligible for CARES Act funding. So normally we'd have to spend a little time talking about what constitutes low per capita income or high unemployment, but under the CARES Act and under the current environment, every county in Georgia is eligible, as is every county in the entire United States. And I don't think we've ever had a situation where all United States counties are eligible for our programs, but this is certainly very unique circumstances. So it's very easy to submit to EDA an eligible project. It's much more difficult to submit to EDA a competitive project. We look at a number of factors when we consider project competitiveness. One of the factors we look at is the cost per job, and EDA, not surprisingly, likes a very low cost per job. We also like a lot of private investment. So the lower the cost per job, the higher the private investment, the more competitive your application is going to be. We like high quality jobs. We try not to engage in minimum wage type jobs or retail, part-time, that sort of thing. We like high quality jobs, and we like a lot of them. Cash match, the regulations allow for in-kind, but cash is more competitive. In a moment, I'll talk about just how much cash we generally require with our programs. Distressed region, the more distressed you are, the more economically distressed your region is, the more competitive your application is. Doesn't mean we don't fund projects in wealthier areas. It just means if you're more distressed, your application might be more competitive than someone who lives in a wealthier area, but we fund projects in both. So in terms of specific information about the CARES Act, I've got a couple bullet points here. The Atlanta Regional Office, the agency, EDA received $1.5 billion, and of that pot, the Atlanta Regional Office for our 8 states received $248 million. Now, just to give you some context, in most years, our office, our 8 states receive about $25 to $40 million. So this is a 7, 8, 10-fold increase over what we normally get. So it's a lot of money, but some of that money is already spoken for. We have some non-competitive programs, some extra funds that went to our regional partners, like the regional commissions we have partnerships with, our university centers. So that carved out a little bit of that 248. We also have a number of applications in-house already that we were not able to fund last year through a disaster supplemental we received after Hurricane Michael. And even in the previous year after Hurricane Irma, we had some projects that we reviewed that did quite well, but we couldn't fund them because we ran out of money. So we're going to recompete them under this CARES Act. It doesn't mean they're more competitive than anything you're going to submit. It just means that they've already been reviewed. We've gone through our due diligence, and we may or may not decide they're worthy of funding, but they obviously have had a head start. There is no award limit, but there is a practical limit. The largest grant I've ever been associated with in the state of Georgia is an $8 million grant we made to the city of Albany to bury some electrical and fiber optic lines in and around a 33 block area of the city. Most of our grants, particularly disaster grants, average between 1.5 to 2.5 million. That's pretty normal for us. Doesn't mean we won't consider something higher. But anytime you get us out of our comfort zone and get us into that $4 or $5 million range, let's say, we expect to see greater economic benefits. But 1.5, 2.5, that's a pretty reasonable amount for us. So the funds are available till September 30th, 2022, but they're going to be gone long before that. In fact, I'm telling folks that if you have an application that you want to submit, you should do so sometime in mid-June of this year, okay, like the next 3 or 4 weeks. We're going to have a review sometime at the end of June, beginning part of July. And if your application doesn't get in on time, we're still going to review it. We're just going to bump it to the next review, which may happen at the end of July, beginning of August. But we may be out of funds by then. Previous years, our disaster funds went a lot quicker than I expected them to. And so you don't want to be left out. If you have a good project, you want to get in an application in the next few weeks, and I can help you do that. So one of the additional requirements of the CARES Act is, well, we're not calling it a nexus statement. Previous disasters, we had what we call the nexus statement, where it asks you to describe the disaster and how the project helps you recover from that disaster. But we are requiring a very similar statement, and it's going to cover a lot of the same information. It need not be too detailed, and it only needs to be 1 page, but it needs to discuss how COVID-19 has impacted your region in terms of job loss, business loss, that sort of thing, how the project will help you recover from that job loss, and also how the project is going to build resiliency in your economy. Okay, so the next time there's a pandemic or next time there's a hurricane or whatever the disaster might be, you're not going to suffer the same consequences that you suffered previously. So you want to build resiliency in your region, and so that's where you explain how you're going to do that. Now, our grant rates, we don't grant funds at 100% normally. We only granted a percentage of the scope of work of the EDA cost. So most of our grant rates are between 50 and 80%. So if you have a $1 million water line, the most we're probably going to award is $800,000. So you have to come up with $200,000 in non-federal cash match. We have some flexibility this time around that we don't normally have. We can sometimes exceed that 80%, but it's going to take some very unique circumstances. You probably should apply as close to that 80% as you can. We're not going to reject the application because they asked for too much, but we may come back to you later and say, well, we can't do 80%, but we can do 70%, or we can do 60%, or whatever number makes sense for us. We're not trying to nickel and dime you, but what we are trying to do is we're trying to maximize our resources, because funds that we don't make towards your award, we can often make an award somewhere else. And our objective as an office is to try to disperse our funds throughout our region, our 8-state region, as equitably as possible. And so that's why we do that. We try to make the project work, but maybe not at the exact amount that you're asking for, but we'll work with you, perhaps help you reduce the scope of work or find other resources. But at the end of the day, we're going to try to make the project work if we feel it's a competitive and worthwhile project. The next point might be the most important. Don't begin any work until you actually have the award in hand. And that means don't go out to bid, don't start construction, certainly, you will jeopardize your EDA award if you do any of that. Now, if you've worked with the Georgia Department of Community Affairs on their CDBG program or One Georgia Authority, they issue what's called pre-agreement cost approval, or PACA. We don't do PACA. So they're a lot more flexible than we are when it comes to that. For us, you cannot begin on the EDA scope of work until you actually have the award in hand. Now, there is some work you can do. The company, for example, could begin construction on their facility. You should have a conversation with us ahead of time just so we know what's going on. But in terms of the EDA scope, nothing can take place. The application, you can attain that off of grants.gov. If you don't have an account with grants.gov, you should have one. It's from what I hear, I've never gone through it. It can be a time-consuming process, so you should get registered, because that's how you apply. We only accept electronic submissions. We don't accept paper submissions anymore. And you also need to register with the System for Award Management, or SAM. You need to be registered in those two systems in order to apply for an EDA grant. So I just wanted to share some examples of some recent projects that we've done, not just in Georgia, but throughout our 8-state region. And you can see the types of communities, the types of applicants we work with, a lot of cities, a couple development authorities. The award amounts tend to be in that $1.5 to $2.5 million range. We go up a little bit. You see my Albany project there for $8 million. It's quite the outlier. Most of our grants don't get that high. And you see the activities, a lot of infrastructure and incubators, some workforce development centers. And you see a couple non-construction projects. We don't do a lot of non-construction projects. I anticipate we'll do a lot more under the CARES Act. But you can see we did a workforce study in Colquitt County. We did that earlier this year. And I had to go back all the way to 2015 for the Atlanta Beltline feasibility study project we did. And that's the only non-construction projects we've done since 2015. So not a lot, but the funds are certainly available for that type of activity. And lastly, just my contact information. It's best to send me an email and schedule a time to talk. I'm sure you don't like playing phone tag any more than I do, and my calendar has gotten quite crowded lately. And so if you send me an email, I'll respond pretty quickly and let you know what my availability is, and we can come up with a time. It might be a half hour from the time we send the email, or it might be the next day, but we'll have a conversation probably in the next 24 hours if you just send me an email, and we can schedule something. So that's all I have. I'm happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Okay. Welcome, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for your great presentation. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder to the attendees, you can still submit questions in the questions pane in your control panel during this time. I'm now going to go into a few of the questions that we received. The first one would be, for the incubator in Valdosta, did that include programming as well as construction? And I guess this would go for any project similar to that.
Yeah, that went toward acquisition. I think it went toward acquisition and rehabilitation of an existing building. We typically do not get involved in the operations side of an incubator. We like the folks to come to us with a good, solid operations plan. So we ask for like a 5-year pro forma to show the revenues and the uses of funds, and an explanation of where operational expenses are coming from through rents or some dedicated funding stream. We don't like to fund operations. We just like to be in the bricks and mortar.
Gotcha. Another question would be, how important are partnerships in a factor in reviewing your applications?
Well, it depends. It depends on the project. Sometimes partnerships are incredibly important, especially if you're trying to corral a lot of different resources, like an incubator project, for example. We like to see university involvement or college involvement in the activities that are taking place at the incubator. A lot of times local governments don't have the capacity to offer the kinds of services that incubators require. So We like to see university or college involvement, and that partnership can take on many forms. It could be they could be a formal applicant. There could be an MOU. Could be a letter of support. There's lots of ways to demonstrate what the partnership may be. The stronger the partnership, the more likely we are to support the project. If it's a weaker partnership, then maybe not so much. Let me just mention this in terms of who we require for an applicant. 100% of the time, we're going to require the property owner, whoever the property owner is, to be an applicant. Now, sometimes that might be a development authority, but the development authority may not have the staff capacity to manage a federal grant. So the city or the county may also be a co-applicant. They may even be the lead applicant because they're the ones who are going to be receiving the paperwork and paying the bills and doing all that work. Development authority might be the title holder of that property, and so we are required to have them as an applicant to the project. But anyone beyond the property owner, it's the option of the applicant to decide if there should be other parties to the project.
Sounds good. One that I think everybody's probably going to be interested in. Can you give some examples of projects that would be ineligible?
Well, you know, if anyone on this call remembers Brian Williamson at the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, he had something he said about CDBG regulations, and he said they're so wide you can drive a Mack truck through it. That can be said for EDA as well. There's a very few activities that are straight up ineligible. It's easier to talk about what's competitive and that's what's not competitive, because what's not eligible, it's a pretty narrow, group of activities that might seem obvious. But in terms of competitive activities, or not competitive activities, we're not going to get into operations of anything. We're not going to buy supplies. Okay, and when I say we're not going to do it, doesn't mean we can't do it. It doesn't mean we won't do it, and it doesn't mean we haven't done it in the past. It just means that this is something we're probably not going to be involved with. We are primarily in the bricks and mortar business, so any kind of construction activity, we can purchase machinery and equipment. We can purchase property, although we have some very tight restrictions on the acquisition of assets. We take a first lien on those assets, so there can be no subordinate financing. If you're working with a bank, the bank cannot be in a superior position to the federal government. So there's some severe restrictions when we purchase property, for example. But again, try to keep us out of the operations side of any project. Try to keep us out of the supply side. We don't like to buy furniture. There's things like that, incidental aspects of the project. We're pretty much a bricks and mortar agency.
Gotcha. When we talk about employment, if a project's going to employ people initially but not in the long term, is that something that's eligible?
Eligible, yes. We are all about long-term employment. So when we receive a commitment from a company to create jobs and make private investment, their commitment speaks of permanent full-time jobs. Some folks like to talk about the construction employment, and that's kind of baked into the cake of our projects. But so, what we try to collect over a number of years is how much permanent employment our projects have helped to generate, and so we get that directly from the employer.
Gotcha. Kind of a fairly quick question, but one that I'm sure a few organizations are looking at is, can an organization submit more than one application?
Yes, there's no limit necessarily, but as I said earlier, we like to spread our funds around our 8 states as equitably as possible. And so we may not be inclined to make 2 awards to the same community during the same sort of funding period. Doesn't mean we can't, and if we get totally blown away by 2 spectacular projects, I doubt we would say no. But if we're looking at 2 projects that are kind of on the fence, we might go with the project that we haven't funded in the same community. We may be looking at a different community. It doesn't come up that much. Last round we had a couple projects from the same community. One was stronger than the other, And so, one scored higher and the other one just didn't score at all. But it had nothing to do with the fact that it was the same community. Just had to do that one was a weaker project than the other.
Gotcha. As far as eligibility, would be constructing an access for a private entity be an eligible project?
Yeah, I mean, a road project, most of our projects go up to the property line. We can't go beyond the public right of way, for example. So if we do a road project in an industrial park, our roads will go right up to that manufacturer and it stops right there. We won't go onto their property. But everything we do, no matter what it is, needs to be owned by an eligible entity. And the folks that are not eligible are private for-profit businesses and individuals. Just about everyone else is eligible for our programs.
We had a number of questions that were similar to this. I'm going to try to put them together and get a cohesive question, but generally on the lines, is this program more supportive of Metro Atlanta communities? I think you noted, and if you could generally explain what the Atlanta Regional Office is and what it addresses, and how it impacts rural communities as well.
Well, we were, as an agency, set up in 1965 as one of those war on poverty agencies, and our early participation was in rural areas primarily. The way our regulations are written and the way we measure distress generally favor
I think Jonathan just froze for a second. Hopefully we'll get him back real soon.
Well, I will be compiling your questions while we're waiting for Jonathan to return and get back to them. Oh, I think we've lost him altogether. I will ask him that question again because it was a question that a number of folks had asked in general. So we'll see if we can get him back here in a minute.
Jonathan, are you there?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're back.
Hello? Okay, great. I don't know what happened. Right. Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, we lost you kind of sort of towards the beginning of that answer. So
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're rural or urban. We're looking at economic distress and we're looking at the strength of the project. But every project has its relative strength or weakness based on where it is. So we don't necessarily expect a project in a rural area to match, the same impact as one in an urban area or a wealthier area, for example. So, when we review projects, it's more art than science. We're looking at the project and its relative impact to that region in a lot of cases. So, if you live in a more rural area, you're not necessarily being compared against projects in Atlanta. You're being compared, against the types of projects that you're able to generate as an applicant. And it's not an easy question to answer, but we distribute we're very mindful of where our funds are going and try to distribute them as equitably throughout, not just our 8 states, but in Georgia as well.
Gotcha. Another good question is about public transportation. Are public transportation projects eligible for funding through this program?
We've never done any. Doesn't, or at least I haven't. It doesn't mean we can't. Sometimes we think about, well, what's the right role for EDA and what's the right role for other agencies. So we might look at Department of Transportation as a more likely place for a project like that to be funded. I can't think of any examples, but for the right project, we can do public transportation. But we're not going to buy buses, we're not going to buy vans. We can, but that's just not a project we're going to probably involve ourselves with. So it might just fall into that category of eligible, but not necessarily competitive unless there's a real compelling reason to do it. But there's nothing to say we can't do it.
Right. Another question, and you touched on this a bit in your presentation, but a question was, is a speculative building eligible?
Eligible, yes. Again, competitive, maybe, maybe not. In this environment with the CARES Act, we are probably we're going to cast a much wider net when it comes to projects we're going to fund. And so if ever there was a time to come at us with a speculative project, this might be the time. In normal years, spec building is not something that I think we would fund. We've done them in the past, but circumstances are very unique. So it's not a project I would encourage. I know the One Georgia Authority has done a number of spec buildings with, some success here and not so much in other places. But, I think we'd be more inclined to, to build that water line or sewer line to the spec building. That would be a better role for us, but we certainly can do it.
Sounds good. Kind of on a similar line, but more operational, would a facility purchase to make a second operational site with renovations be eligible? The property would have to be purchased with EDA funds as well as the renovations.
Yeah, we're doing that in Valdosta. I think we're helping acquire that one, but we're definitely helping to renovate. And we're doing a project in Statesboro where we are acquiring and no, not acquiring, but we're renovating a separate expansion of their existing incubator, which we did help to purchase. So that's absolutely eligible. You just do need to be mindful that whenever we're in the acquisition business and rehab business, we're going to take that first mortgage. And that sometimes can place some severe restrictions on the property. For example, the federal government controls it for 20 years once our award is made. So there's a lot to consider. And so if there's a specific project someone wants to talk about, I'd be happy to do that. Just be mindful, just in general terms, that anytime we get into the building renovation or acquisition business, the federal government is going to tie some strings to that project.
That sounds good. And this might be an issue for a lot of smaller communities and communities in general during this time. Local match is going to be a real issue for this community. Is there an opportunity to get a waiver? I know you did mention the match requirements.
There is, the CARES Act does say we can go up to 100%. Okay. And what we look at is the local government and their capacity to take on additional debt. We look at their financial circumstances. I suspect a lot of folks are going through some tough times, and again, it's not our desire to nickel and dime communities and try to get as much out of them as we can. Our desire is to spread our funds as widely as possible. But if the circumstances are right, they have an opportunity to make that case to us, and I think we'll listen. I only make a recommendation to our review committee, and they accept or don't accept my recommendation. But I know a lot of folks are struggling, and this is a very unique time. And I think if the circumstances are right, it is something that we would seriously consider not allowing or not requiring any match, or so being more flexible with time, perhaps.
Yeah, and so it would be a good opportunity to submit if you did not have the funding match, and you would work with that community.
We'd always work with them, but I think we would want to identify something that we can use as match. It's difficult sometimes to accept an in-kind commitment as match because we reimburse contractors, and it's hard to reimburse a contractor with an in-kind match commitment. So that's why the cash is often important. But we have some flexibility this time around that we don't normally have. So it's going to be a case-by-case situation.
Right, with many of the projects. Is there an opportunity for communities to apply for funds to do like a phase 1, which would be the engineering of a project, and during the same cycle, do a phase 2, which would be the construction?
We usually, I mean, we can pay for professional services and construction all at once. There's no real reason to break it into a phase 1 or phase 2. Oftentimes, if we do phases, it'll be an industrial park where they want to do the first half 1 year and then the second half the next year, or then, a couple years from now. What we need to track on and why that sometimes doesn't work is we're typically looking for jobs in private investment. And so if all the jobs in private investment are identified in that phase 1 project, that phase 2 project becomes less competitive. So the applicant needs to find new beneficiaries for that phase 2. With engineering and construction, though, that can be packaged as one application. That need not be two.
True. And a follow-up question to that, a little bit more operational. If a project is already somewhat underway and the construction company was already selected, in this particular case, it was due to the support of the project and they're providing their services at cost. Are they too far down the line to now apply for funds?
I missed the first part of that question. But generally, if work has begun, that typically kicks it out. We're not usually able to participate in any project where the work has already begun. If there are activities that are not yet funded and no contracts have been signed or any of that scope of work has been started, we can then come in with a grant. But if they've already begun work, I'm not sure how that would look if they're doing their work at cost. If our grant would be used to pay them for additional work they're doing, I think that would be a situation where they should contact me and we'll talk about the situation. But that would be a very unique set of circumstances.
Yeah, I think they already have a construction company chosen for the work, but the work hasn't been done. So I think they're just asking if they've already selected someone, if that makes the project ineligible.
Well, probably. We do have some flexibility insofar as we could go back and make sure they procured that contractor or that professional service provider. If they procured them competitively, then it's something we can look at. But it may be that what they're doing is eligible and it's fine. It becomes a competitiveness question insofar as you've already signed contracts, you've already begun work. Why do you need an EDA grant? You've already decided you can do this. And so it really just becomes a competitiveness question that our review panel kind of struggles with. But given what's going on right now, a lot of folks are taking their local match and dedicating it to more urgent concerns. And so I think that's what we're going to be looking at perhaps with this round of funding. And so, nothing is off the table.
Gotcha. And I think that's a clear indication from what you're discussing in all of these answers, that it really is going to be on a case-by-case basis. And if you have specific questions, that you're happy to help people with those.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you have mentioned in your presentation that funds were available for economic development, but not for community development. Could you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Well, community development, in our world is parks, recreation, city halls, courthouses, rec centers, a lot of downtown projects fall into that community development category, depending on how they're kind of put together. Our programs are specific to jobs and private investment. And so any competitive application that we review needs to demonstrate direct jobs and private investment that hasn't occurred yet, or at least a strategy to get there. And that's got to be the focus. That's why we exist as an agency. So that has to be the focus of any project we do.
Gotcha. Can you also explain what a planning project that might be eligible would be?
Well, any kind of project that has an economic development focus. So like the Atlanta Beltline was a planning project that we did a number of years ago, and that was to look at a small area that the Atlanta Beltline wanted to turn into like a makerspace or an innovation hub. And so our grant funds paid for them to analyze that space and determine what was feasible for that space. And so any project along those lines where, if you wanted a plan for an incubator, for example, we've done plenty of grants like that. If you had an economic strategy, if you wanted to determine the best use of 100 acres or whatever it is in your area that you want to turn into some economic asset, that's something we could pay for. Engineering reports. As long as the focus is economic development, we're going to consider it.
Gotcha. And let's see, this kind of goes along with some of the other phased projects that we've been discussing. If someone has already engineered a sewer project or similar to that and want to apply for funding for the construction, if they haven't started it, is that an eligible project?
It is. If we're not paying for the activity, we take kind of a minimal role in overseeing that activity. So if they've already paid for the engineering, there's some basic, I think it's the Brooks Act, that they need to adhere to, which essentially says that the professional service provider needs to be qualified. That's an engineering question, but I'm not qualified to answer that. But they can do certain aspects of the project if they haven't started the construction piece yet and they haven't gone out to bid, then that's absolutely fair game for EDA support.
Sounds good. This might be a bit of a specific question, and we'll see if it's something you can give a general answer for, and we might be able to get you in touch with this person after. But can you provide more detail / background into the workforce studies and training funding structure and outcome for Moultrie, Colquitt, and Cape Fear Community College, North Carolina?
I can't speak to the North Carolina one, but the Moultrie Colquitt one was a recent grant, and that was essentially a workforce study where they wanted to determine, they wanted to work with their regional employers and determine what were the skills needed in the future, next 10, 20 years. And so to help direct their technical colleges in that direction, they wanted to make sure that their technical colleges were prepared for the workforce needs that the companies in that region were going to require. And so the purpose of the study is to determine what exactly those skills are. So that's that project. I can't speak to the North Carolina project, but the Colquitt project is very similar to a lot of workforce studies we do. That's a real typical request when it comes to workforce. A lot of communities want to know, what the future holds, and so they'll ask us for support to develop a study that will allow them to determine what those needs may be so they can better advise their colleges and universities.
Sounds good. I'm going to generalize this question a little bit, but what is the likelihood of a small project that's a small public project that's part of a larger private project that would run something similar to an electric business or an electric utility? And I think you maybe discussed what can be used as public funds and conjunction with private funds.
Well, not sure I understand the question. Private funds can be used in cooperation with EDA funds as match. It's fair game as match. We need to differentiate between what we call private investment and matching funds. Private investment is our public benefit. It's basically what's taxable, to a region. And so we track on the private investment that the company's making in facilities and machinery and equipment. And then the matching funds go toward the scope of work that EDA is helping support. And those matching funds can be from any source except for other federal grant funds. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but the private funds, can work in cooperation with EDA funds.
Gotcha. So let's see. I'll go in here. Back to a little transportation question. Are shovel-ready transportation projects more competitive than the planning/design phase?
I don't know if they're more competitive. You know, the more competitive projects are the ones that demonstrate direct economic benefits. So we're looking for, you know, if we're looking for jobs, we're looking for private investment. If it's shovel ready and it's you know, a speculative project, you know, that's not necessarily more competitive than a planning project. You know, I don't know if that factors into our decision making at all. You know, our projects have to be completed within 3 years. You know, we make the award, there's 24 months of design and engineering, then there's 12 months of construction. So, I mean, that's, you know, a relatively quick turnaround. If you're able to do that construction quicker and close it out, and you're able to demonstrate that in the application, I imagine that would make our engineers happy. And so maybe that would make for a more competitive application, but I'm not sure that really factors into our decision making.
Okay, gotcha. What are some factors that would make a recovery/resiliency statement particularly competitive in EDA's eyes?
Well, I mean, essentially, there's 3 components. There's, you know, what is the disaster you suffered? How does the project address that disaster? Okay, how does it make things better? And how does the project
Oh, I think we may have lost Jonathan again. Hopefully he'll come back up. In the interim, one of our attendees asked, sorry if I missed this, but there's a time grant request is submitted. When would the notification come? He did indicate, and I don't know when the notifications would come, that people need to be working on their applications fairly quickly and getting them into EDA as soon as they can. Let's see if there's any other questions I might be able to answer. And he did note, another question is, do you anticipate exhausting the funds given that they are tenfold typical of your typical amount? Are the regions talking to one another and comparing notes on the types of requests coming in? I won't be able to answer the second part of the question, but I think he did answer these. Oh, I think
I lost you. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure what's happening. I forget the question.
Well, we could go on to
next.
And I think you answered this question a little bit, but we'll take this question and one other, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. Do you anticipate exhausting the funds given they are tenfold the typical amount? And are the regions talking to one another and comparing notes about projects that are coming in?
Answer to the second question, no. You know, we're kind of off doing our own thing, so we're not really paying attention to what Philadelphia is doing or Austin. But you know, I don't know. These funds, there's a lot of funds. There's gonna be a lot of demand on those funds. It's a very competitive process, and so I don't know how long they're going to be around. If I had a project, I'd want to make sure I got in that mid-June date. So, Jesus, did I lose everyone? Did I lose you?
I can still hear you, but
I just turned off the webcam, so hopefully that will help with the freezing up.
Okay. Right. So, you know, if I had a serious application, I wouldn't want to wait past that mid-June deadline or soft deadline. But, you know, again, I'd be surprised if we're spending all that money before July 4th. You know, we're identifying projects, but the disaster funds we've received in the past through Hurricane Michael and Hurricane Irma went a lot quicker than I ever thought they would. So, you know, we may have some left over, and I'd be a little surprised if we didn't, but, you know, that's You'd be really risking things if you waited too far beyond that.
Right. And you had mentioned, we'll do one last question, a question regarding regulations, but you had mentioned the Brooks Act earlier, and someone asked, are there federal requirements like NEPA associated with these funds?
Yes, there's a NEPA review on every construction project.
Gotcha. So any of the federal requirements that are usually associated with federal funds probably apply to this as well.
Yep, absolutely.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Well, I think we
it's
answered.
very similar to CDBG.
Great. Well, I think we answered most of the questions, and as we mentioned, you can see both Jonathan and my contact information on the screen. We'd be happy to talk to you further about any of the questions you might have. And I thank everyone for attending our webinar. Again, if you have any other questions, please contact myself or Jonathan. You will receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. I want to thank Jonathan so much for his time today and his very informative presentation and answer to all of the questions. And on behalf of the Atlanta Regional Commission and our presenter, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.